This talk is based on a paper that is currently under review. It's a rather large paper, and I say a lot in it. And so today, all I really have time for is to talk about why AI cannot be trustworthy yet. But I go into the paper basically demonstrating that once we sort of do make sense of what it means to be trustworthy, and if we were to design an AI to be trustworthy, that it doesn't solve a number of problems related to vulnerability and using AI. And so that's sort of the goal of that paper. But like I said, I don't have time for that today. So it's just today, why AI can't be trustworthy yet. Okay, good. So I'll start moving on here. So trust is, of course, an essential factor in human decisions, one that shapes and constrains our actions towards individuals, organizations, and institutions. And crucially, this role may now be extending to certain sufficiently sophisticated artifacts, right? Since the emergence of automated systems and more recently systems of artificial intelligence as integral parts of the decision-making process, questions concerning trust in AI have been at the forefront of research. This steadily increasing and encompassing role of intelligent machines has culminated in calls from both industry leaders and regulative bodies to develop so-called trustworthy AI. This talk aims to expose the wrong-headedness of this call. And to understand the call for trustworthy AI, it's essential to recognize it as downstream from an earlier push for developing trustworthy automation. This led to the development of prominent models, and we heard from Marcus earlier a number of these models, for the dynamics of human-machine interaction that remain deeply influential today, as we saw. Moreover, careful analysis of the literature on trust in AI, it reveals a conceptual indebtedness to various models of interpersonal trust, and such influences expose this underlying assumption that continues to shape contemporary discourse in AI ethics, the assumption that trust not only mediates interpersonal relationships, but also relationships between people and automation. Furthermore, it's important to emphasize that these are models, and models are just mere descriptions of the world, like the model of a solar system. It doesn't explain why the model's accurate. So on a very fundamental level, a philosophical level, it remains unclear what it means to say that an automated system is or should be trustworthy. Through its conceptual analysis of trust, moral philosophy, surprisingly enough, has yielded a relative consensus surrounding the proposal that trustworthiness is constituted chiefly by two components: reliability on the one hand, and some additional X factor on the other. And all the controversy surrounds what that complement to reliability is. So what we might call the trust equation construes trustworthiness as this. It's essentially solving the sum of reliability plus X. But despite decades, of course, of debate, hardly any agreement has emerged about the correct solution, with prominent views solving X in various ways. So we have net buyers, goodwill and intention. We have Luhmann's normative social interaction. Lano suggests this emotional sensitivity to moral values. And more recently, Hardin has this interest encapsulation, that my interest as the truster are had by the trustee. There's this encapsulation of interest. One common thread that plausibly strings all of these different views together is that trust, over and above mere reliability and reliance and so on, involves an additional normative evaluation, additional normative appraisal on the part of the trustor about the trustee, one that is not necessarily, but characteristically, a moral appraisal. Okay, so it's thus a matter of deep controversy whether trustworthy AI is part of the solution to the so-called alignment problem, the problem of how to ensure that AI does not operate contrary to our values, or whether, on the other hand, it carves a larger cleft between our technology and our values. Some philosophers hold a positive stance towards trusting AI, offering minimal notions of moral agency and moral accountability. I'm thinking of Floridi in Oxford, while others are critical of the call for trustworthy AI. I'm thinking of my supervisor, Ophelia, but also others in the field, Moore, Bryson, Ryan. They argue that this talking about trustworthy AI is effectively normalizing anthropomorphization. And that's a category mistake, right? With potential disastrous consequences in the age of misinformation, where AI, in virtue of its capacity to simulate human behavior, becomes too often deployed as a tool for societal, economic, and political manipulation. So to that end, what I want to do today is to show you why AI cannot be trustworthy, why it's wrongheaded to think of it as even capable of being trustworthy, at least not yet. Okay, so let's get into that. So why AI can't be trustworthy yet? So here's the idea. We got to start with making sense of what trust is. Like I mentioned before, there's all these models that are out there, but models don't explain why they work. They are just descriptions. So we need to, if you want to know why the model of the solar system works the way that it does, we go to a physicist. So if we want to know why the model of trust works the way it does, you need to go to some philosophical analysis and probably some social science and behavioral science. As I mentioned in the introduction, the consensus in moral philosophy is that trust, beyond mere reliability, entails an additional normative evaluation made by the trustor about the trustee. In other words, trust involves this evaluative process where the trustor believes and or treats the trustee as appropriately responsive to contextually relevant, usually but not necessarily moral norms. And these norms go beyond the mere norms of reliability, like consistency. So accordingly, trustworthiness is the property that a trustee has that would justify categorically the evaluation relative to some specific agent and some specific context. So what does that mean exactly? So to put a real simple gloss on that, the following normative evaluation is that that distinguishes trust from reliance is to say this: to trust an agent is to believe she will do the right thing for the right reasons. It's just basically that simple. And so to put that even to more of a more concrete example, take the example of a trust scientist, a data scientist. In the context of data science, right, to say that you have a trustworthy data scientist is to say that you believe that she does the right thing. For example, she ensures the data collection process is representative of the target population, and she does it for the right reasons, which is she does this because this avoids biased results. And when we say she's trustworthy, we're saying that she does indeed do these things for these reasons in this context. Okay, so now the question is, right, returning back to whether AI can be trustworthy, is whether it can now be understood. We can now understand this claim to be basically saying, you know, can an AI do the right thing for the right reasons? Well, the capacity to do the right thing for the right reasons requires the agent to be able to not only detect moral norms, but also to be able to act on behalf of moral norms, or at least act in adherence to moral norms. Now, I'm using these terms in a very technical way that I'll explain later on. And I aim to argue that AI possesses neither the cognitive repertoire for acting on behalf of norms, nor the emotional resources for acting in adherence to norms. And essentially, AI cannot do this, can do neither, because to the degree that we can say a machine can act, it can only act in accordance with rules, which are like norms in that they prescribe action, but very much unlike them because of their rigidity and how they do not demand that they be internalized by agents in order to act according to them. So I'm going to talk more about what exactly that all means. Let's first talk about how rules and norms are not the same thing, right? So acting in accordance with rules is insufficient for an ability to act on behalf of norms. So for example, we understand that Jupiter obeys the laws of planetary motion, right? But we also understand that there's a universe of nuance between Jupiter doing so as a consequence of natural law, for example, and a person's decision not to steal because it is morally wrong, right? It makes little sense to describe the propensity of Jupiter to travel around the sun at 47,000 kilometers an hour as a norm, because this propensity is extremely rigid, and because Jupiter does not possess any capacity for internalizing Kepler's laws, such that it would make sense to conceive of Jupiter as acting on behalf of them or acting in adherence to them. Meanwhile, it can be said of the person deciding not to steal a loaf of bread for the reason that it is morally wrong, that he acts on behalf of norms or in adherence to norms rather than mere rules due to at least two reasons. Number one, the rule about not stealing is flexible. For example, the agent might decide that he really ought to steal the loaf of bread since he will then be able to feed it to his starving family. Second, how this flexibility emerges ought to be explained, at least in part, by the agent exercising capacities for internalizing the rule. In other words, an agent's ability to act in defiance of the rule, that is, to determine for himself that the norm of not stealing ought to be superseded by the norm of caring for one's family, is explained by his having internalized these rules, which in the context of people like us means that we've made sense of them. We've become emotionally sensitive to them and we've conceptualized them. Of course, other properties distinguish norms from rules, like their source of justification in the context of their origin, but these two traits suffice for now. Okay, so Alan Gibbard is a meta-ethicist, and he has a really interesting naturalistic theory on the origin of normativity. Where did norms come about? Why do we have norms? And it helps us define these internalization processes, right? For both an act, for acting on behalf of norms and for this ability to act in adherence to norms. And his theory begins with the premise that normative judgments arose from our need as a species to coordinate and cooperate with one another. And if that's true, it suggests that rudimentary aspects of our, as of now, sophisticated capacities for dealing with norms is shared by some non-human animals, especially those whose survival is dependent on predicting conspecific behavior. So according to Gibbard, the ability to govern oneself according to norms rather than mere rules can manifest itself in virtue of two distinct capacities. To illustrate these capacities, Gibbard discusses the famous experiment on obedience conducted by Milgram in 1974. This very famous study, subjects, right, are instructed to administer these electric shocks to other subjects, while being told that these shocks will become increasingly painful and even deadly. Secretly working with the experimenter, the supposed victim is never actually shocked, right? But somewhat surprisingly, 2/3 of subjects do all they are instructed to do, even though they become increasingly upset and protest against doing it. So for Gibbard, the fact that subjects, on the one hand, actively protest complying with the experimenter's instructions, and on the other hand, nonetheless decide to comply with those instructions, reveals a deep insight into both human and animal psychology, exposing this phylogenetic origins of our normativity. So as Gibbard understands it, Milgram's experiment reveals that we can be motivated by a more primitive, but nonetheless normative faculty, one that has the potential to exert a strong influence over behavior. He proposes a psychological hypothesis for explaining this discrepancy in motivation exposed by Milgram's work, one based on two distinct normative capacities. You have an emotional capacity, which is shared with some animals and has the potential to motivate, demotivate, and constrain our behavior. And you have the conceptual capacity, which is this linguistically infused capacity that evolved because of the advantages of coordination and planning through language. So Gibbard describes the process of internalizing norms that comprises the emotional capacity as follows. He says, a norm prescribes a pattern of behavior, and to internalize a norm is to have a motivational tendency of a particular kind to act on that pattern. So for Gibbard, tendencies are these evolutionary adaptations for coordination, while emotion explains the motivation to perform the action and adhere to the norm. He says, when a person's emotions tend to follow a pattern in this way, we can say that the person internalizes the norm that prescribes the pattern. On the other hand, the conceptual capacity, Gibbard argues this faculty depends on language. Why? Because it depends on what we call propositional thought that produces mental representations, like a sentence or also something that I might see in the world as a mental representation, as capable of being wrong or false or inapt. Specifically here, norms as norms, which have this effect of enriching an agent's decision-making repertoire to allow motivation based on norms as such. There are things that I do because it is the norm, right? And I'm representing that it could be other ways. but I don't do it. I do it because it is the norm. That's a very sophisticated thing that we can do. So by adopting Gibbert's naturalistic theory on the origins of normativity, it becomes evident how human action is fundamentally different from the action of animals or machines. Our responsiveness to norms arises from conceptual capacities that enable us to represent norms as such. These capacities for what's called in philosophy representing as, which are commonly believed to hold a privileged position in the human cognition toolkit, grounding our theory of mind and a species of metacognition known as meta-representation. This is the capacity to represent mental representations as mental representations, right? As these mental entities with correctness conditions that can misrepresent the world. In other words, conceptual capacities enable humans to represent beliefs as beliefs, which could be false, perceptions as perceptions, which could be inaccurate or illusory, or norms as norms, which can be inapt or reasonable. Crucially, the capacity to meta-represent ought not to be equated with the capacity to explicitly represent, since meta-representation is often argued to enable reflective self-knowledge. I'm thinking of Cecilia Hayes' work. In other words, to act on behalf of norms, agents must also understand the aptness conditions that constitute those norms. Thus, it's important to emphasize that though a time may come when AI possesses the capacity to understand, the current state of AI, and likely far into the future, lacks such sophistication. Thus, AI does not possess conceptual capacities and cannot act on behalf of norms, whether these be moral or otherwise. And so it fails to meet one of the two independent conditions for trustworthiness. Similarly, similar to the issue of attributing conceptual capacities to AI, asserting that AI undergoes emotion to the extent that it would be justified to claim it's motivated to adhere to norms, would be to attribute capacities to AI that is obviously incapable of realizing at this moment in development or at any point. Though a comprehensive understanding of the antecedents of emotion is yet to be fully elucidated, we can nonetheless acknowledge that emotion requires agents possess a complex internal milieu, demanding a delicate balance of homeostatic variables that are crucial for survival. Of course, AI has no internal milieu, and it demands no allostatic processes or molecular turnover. And so AI does not have emotion and thus cannot adhere to norms. And so it fails to fulfill that second condition for trustworthiness. So to sort of sum up here, let's unpack what exactly our discussion entails about trustworthiness. Who can have it and who can't? Consider having the goal of securing your home against a possible intruder. And you're having to choose between three alternatives: hiring a human security guard, training a Rottweiler, or installing an AI security system. Now, an argument ought to be made for how the AI is likely the most reliable of the three, since it needs neither sleep, nor can it be distracted by treats. But given the discussion above, it's far less clear whether an argument can be made for trusting AI with protecting your home. The security guard is capable of being trustworthy because she's capable of acting on behalf of norms, the norms of effective home security. And the Rottweiler is capable of being trustworthy too, but in a more minimal, while nonetheless significant sense, since the dog is capable of feeling motivated to adhere to the norms of territory protection that either nature, training, or both has taught it to regulate its behavior around. But having neither conceptual nor emotional capacities, AI cannot act on behalf of norms, nor can it adhere to norms. It is an anormative agent, if it's an agent at all, and so it cannot be trustworthy. Okay, not so fast, right? There's a worrisome objection here. So before discussing a competing account, I want to make this objection really clear. So consider like an LLM, right? OpenAI's ChatGPT. So this demonstrates a sophisticated capacity to acquire rules, for example, for translating between languages. Models like these employ sophisticated techniques for hierarchical feature detection through implementation of multiple distinct interconnected neural network layers that are designed to detect intricate linguistic patterns and thereby enable the model to acquire, and this is important, rules that exhibit high degrees of flexibility. Consider now a distinct but similarly sophisticated model trained on a large corpus of normative behaviors. relative to, say, the context of moral decision-making, so that the model is designed to acquire highly flexible rules for moral action. Arguably, such sophisticated techniques for so-called machine learning ought to be considered on par with norm internalization, since though obviously not enabling reflective understanding or emotions, they have the potential to yield convincing approximations of norms. So essentially, this counter-argument amounts to underscoring how restricting norm internalization to the two capacities above, the conceptual and the emotional, is potentially anthropocentric, right? Bordering on a kind of neuro-chauvinism. And it does not do justice to the intelligence of artificial agents. So this line of reasoning, it strikes me as deeply worrisome, and it leads me to introduce a third account of normativity, the socio-behavioral account of normativity. I'm thinking of Michael Tomasello's work. So the social behavioral account on the origin of normativity, it holds that a process of norm internalization, it demands an interdependent cooperative socio-ecology, wherein an agent's success depends on conforming behavior to that of other agents within her community. Right? So according to these researchers, normativity emerges out of social conformity, and the process of internalizing norms is accounted for by an agent's ability to acquire appropriate behavioral dispositions through learning and imitation, and crucially, by being evaluated and shaped by others in her community for behaving in ways that these individuals are also disposed to behave. That is, dynamically, should these dispositions culturally develop.
So for your information, you have to wrap up in like 2 minutes or something.
Yeah, no problem. I'm almost done. So conceive this process of norm internalization is as much internal as it is external, right? It's constituted by feedback from other individuals in the community. I'm skipping some stuff, right? And this family of views about the origin of normativity offers an alternative capacity to the ones above, right, for explaining how rules are internalized by agents and become norms, right? It's a social behavioral capacity that enables agents to respond adaptively to pressure, to conform behavior to the shifting dynamics of the community. So what emerges is a plausible strategy now for developing moral machines. To see this, consider an artificial agent designed to exhibit receptivity to the culturally evolving value-based dynamics of its community, while at the same time being treated as malleable along normative dimensions. Thus, other agents hold the artificial agent accountable for its behavior. They praise and blame it. They place normative demands on it, both implicitly through nudging and explicitly through speech, insisting it alter its behavior to conform to the behavior dispositions of the others. Imagine further that the artificial agent is capable of conforming with an appropriate degree of flexibility, wherein its behavior becomes, yes, let us say, aligned with the above conception of trustworthiness in moral decision-making. The AI tends to do the right thing, and when told it is mistaken, it seeks absolution from its community, commits to improving its behavior to conform with the normative demands, follows through on such commitments, and when asked, cites these commitments as explanations for its change in behavior. This would be a complete game changer, and we'd be hard-pressed to say that such an agent is no longer trustworthy. Of course, no AI exhibits such flexible conformity, nor of course is AI being treated as a normative agent in this robust sense, and hence the proposal remains a mere possibility. But in sketching this out, my aim is not only to canvass another condition for normativity, but to underscore that if the social behavioral condition for normativity is on the right track, a possibility that deserves our consideration given its plausibility in explaining normativity in humans, then AI's trustworthiness might ultimately depend on how we decide to deal with it. In other words, whether an artificial agent fulfills the social behavioral condition for normativity will depend on whether we design, deploy, and deal with them as normative agents. Thus, we must ask ourselves, is this really something we value? Or instead, do we wish that this be reserved for agents with a stake in moral outcomes? Indeed, trustworthiness might also demand a stake in moral outcomes, right? Demand that agents possess a proverbial skin in the morality game. Or as John Hoagland famously put it, the trouble with artificial intelligence is that computers just don't give a damn. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, wow. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was quite a ride. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
really, really interesting. Yeah, so are there any questions for John?
I always have questions for John.
You have a lot of questions? Okay, got it. So.
No, I'd just be curious, because you mentioned the word skin, and I often also talk about, before the session today started with talking to Marcus, we talked about, that looking at trust facilitated behaviors is a way of saying I have skin in the game. So we've got this concept of skin, and we've talked about Irina talking about effective touch. So I wonder if you think having skin is important, either because of, on the one hand, so it's a two-sided question. One, do you think that they have to have some vested interest in this process? And the separate question, but which comes under the banner of skin, do you think that having an ability to be touched physically by us, so obviously Irina talked about reciprocity and vulnerability, do you think it needs to be reciprocal? Like how balanced and symmetrical do some of these factors need to be across interacting agents?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I end one of the papers that I have right now under review with this point towards further research that needs to be done. And we really need to think more about what exactly it means to have skin in the morality game. And I don't think anyone has a really good theory about that yet. At least in my research, people point to having a stake in moral outcomes, and they talk about that like we all know what that means. But what does that mean? I don't think it's entirely clear what exactly it means to have a stake, and whether it would be impossible for an artificial agent to have a stake. I'm reminded actually of a philosopher, Albert Camus, and his work, his like humanist sort of philosophy, and what it means to be a living creature, and what it means to be a human being. And what it means to be a human being is to face a world of indifference and a world of injustice, a world of absurdity at times that does not give us answers to the most important questions, a world of vulnerability. And we do this as moral agents, but also as mortal agents, facing a world where we will ultimately die, and our lives will be nothing but some meaningless speck on a planet floating in the void. And that facing up to that and answering that, despite the lack of answers that the world gives us, is to have a stake in these outcomes. And so I think about that, but no one's really kind of given that question the kind of rigor that is deserved of scientific philosophy yet.
Do you think that, just to sort of tag on to that before maybe you tackle whether they need to have actual skin so that they can be touched, do you think that when we move into more truly synergistic hybrid contexts, so at the moment we mainly just use them to offload tasks that we don't want to do, right? I don't really feel like vacuuming, or I don't really feel like mowing the lawn, or I don't really feel like searching my playlist, right? These are just, I'm bored or I'm lazy, so I give this off to somebody else. It's not that we have a truly joint or shared goal. It's not that we're truly working synergistically. And I wonder if this is not going to change if we have a more hybrid workplace, or and I'm thinking, surgical environments where we will expect, it's more about what how expectations will change. Do you not think we will expect that there will be, whether it's an emotional or a benevolent or this other capacity that's required for trust, that this will change as the tasks we share rather than just offload become more complex? What do you think about that?
I'm very cautious about that. And I think the undertone of what I'm trying to say in all of my papers is that we need to be very careful as we go forward about whether that's really something we value. There might be some practical advantages to developing moral machines in the way that I laid out, right? Where they're sort of like raising them like children, right? Teaching them to be normative agents and treating them like normative agents. And I think we already see a kind of machine learning techniques that points in the direction they could learn to become normative. but do we really want that? Because once we start doing that, it becomes a very tricky question of whether they deserve rights. They deserve to be treated fairly. And of course you could say, well, are they conscious? But then we get into like a whole nother sort of thing that we can't possibly answer, right? But their behavior suggests that they are normative, and normative agents deserve some rights. Animals deserve rights. So I just think we have to be very, very careful as we move in that direction. If we are moving there, it's happening, and we need.
But do you think that it's done in parallel? Is it that as we design the robots we need for these more joint synergistic contexts, that we need to consider the moral necessity, that we build into them? Or do we have to first establish whether we want them to be moral agents and therefore want to have these more synergistic relationships? Do you think it's,
yeah.
Which direction is it though? Do you think that before we get anywhere, is this the warning you're giving us, that we need to establish whether we will ultimately require a moral aspect to these agents that they currently don't have a capacity for, and we currently don't know how we would engender it in them, and as such it should preclude us from ever getting to a synergistic context if that's not possible? Is that what you're trying to warn us about?
I mean, that's what I would like everyone to think about. Yes. I don't want to give any answers, because I think this is a type of thing that we need to decide as a society, democratically. So my role is just to say, hey, look, we're going in this direction. It's about ready to sort of open Pandora's box here, and we need to be wary about what comes out of it, because what might come out of it is developing artificial agents that deserve rights, for example. And so like this synergistic thing, like maybe we need to make sure that that's not happening. Like maybe we need to make sure that like they're just tools. And
the problem is that often when we invent tools, we don't envisage all their functions, right? And I think that's what's happened. That's how automation has maybe got out of hand, right? And maybe you could have said that started in the Industrial Revolution. It got out of hand right there and then. We didn't consider the downsides to automation. We just thought, oh, that'll make our life easier. That'll make things get done quicker. So yeah, I think I heed your warning. We are at time for our panel discussion, but we are here as a panel, so we are discussing, we are achieving our goal synergistically, but maybe we should just introduce it for those who maybe just joined us. So we've had a wonderful morning. Our chair is actually Johannes. I will hand over to him if you would like.
Yeah, I just will use the opportunity, and I'm sorry, to ask a last question for John, because I didn't want to interrupt your dialogue earlier. So I just asked ChatGPT version 3.5 if it possesses meta representation. It said yes. And I asked it if it possesses metacognition. It said no, but then it answered, I'm a machine learning model developed by AI. So actually showing some kind of metacognition. And then I said, is this argument not per se metacognition, and thus you just proved yourself wrong? And it said, I apologize for any confusion. The statement I made regarding metacognition was not intended to be self-referential or metacognitive. So I found that really funny, because within like 3 prompts, I had kind of a paradoxon already. What do you think, really also in regard to ChatGPT, should we as a society or from political viewpoint stop the technical development at this point, and just learn how these systems actually work, also in terms of morality and everything and norms, and then like just continue working on them and improving them? Or is this something that is also per se unethical, or like, what is your thoughts on that? So
just real quick to comment on what ChatGPT had to spit out there for you. Remember what it's doing, right? It's just trying to come up with something that sounds like what you might find on the internet, right? And it's just predicting word after word after word. And remember what its words do. They do something that our words don't. Those are not real words. Our words point to things in the world, right? Tables, chairs, people, physics, right? Molecules. their words, the LLMs, their words point to other words, right? Right. They're words that predict other words and other words. So they're fundamentally, that's not really language that you see there. It's language, right? So it's not capable of giving an answer to anything, actually. When it does, it's a happy accident. It's a happy accident because it's trained on a bunch of stuff on the internet. And the fact that the internet could produce right answers to any questions is an accident, right? It's a mess. The internet is a mess. Okay, but to the question of should we sort of put a moratorium on the development of more sophisticated forms of machine learning techniques and models, yes, I signed the very famous letter that went around that we should put a moratorium on this. I signed it. Absolutely, we should. Technology, we ask, how can we do this? And we don't stop, right? From Jurassic Park, the famous line of Ian Malcolm, the mathematician, you ask how, but you don't stop and ask why and whether you should. So we need to stop and ask the ethical questions. Modernity for the past 200 years is marked, and the troubles that we see with late capitalism, right, and global climate change and catastrophes is marked and marred with the fact that we have not asked moral questions and ethical questions and allowed ethical questions to drive our behavior. It's ethics that makes us human beings, right? And so absolutely, we need to put the ethical considerations before, finally, for the first time in human history. Otherwise, we're going to see, things are just going to get worse.
Okay, interesting thoughts.
Yeah.
So Merle, you tried to direct us into the panel discussion. Maybe we give it one more try. Sorry for interrupting this. Yeah, so I hand over the moderation function to Irene and Merle now, I would say, because I'm part of the panel myself. And yeah, so we agreed already to discuss mainly two questions. One being, do we still need trust or trustworthiness? And the second one being, if so, or independent of that question, how do we actually measure it? Yeah, so let's ask the bigger question first. Do we still need trust? Or maybe everyone is saying something on his position then first. Yep. So I understand the panel is consisting of John, me, and Marcus now, right? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, John, you go first.
Yeah. So I think, as I made clear in my presentation, trustworthiness is basically kind of like a human-only thing. And whenever we talk about trusting machines, we're either doing one of two things, right? We're either sort of making a category mistake, like when I say the machine thinks, or if I say a submarine swims or something, these are category mistakes. They're fine. Or I'm speaking in this kind of metaphorical way, where what really needs to be trustworthy is the designers, the implementers, the regulators, and all this stuff, the people behind all this technology, right? And I guess the third thing, I said two. I guess the third thing that I'm doing is I'm just using the word reliability. That's what I'm really saying, is I'm just saying this is reliable, I can rely on this. And I'm using the word trust because because that's just another word that sort of means that, right? But when we think really hard about what trust is, it's this fundamental thing in our social lives that holds our lives together as people, right? And we can't really extend it to things that are non-normative, right? Unless we do it metaphorically. So if we talk about them as tools, then reliability is fine, right? But so yeah, I think that's clear. That's sort of what I'm saying.
Okay, so Marcus would be the next. Would you tell his position on that?
Yeah, I can. Or Mirla, did you want to jump in? Or
you go ahead. I'm happy to wait my turn.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with many things that John said in his talk and right now, because I also see that issue of trustworthiness becoming too much of a a term that actually should only be used for humans or trusts. So I agree with many of these things, and I heard it from the philosophers I'm working with also. At the same time, it's this question of how we speak and the question of whether we should even like distinguish between the people behind the system and the system. That's my biggest question here, whether we can say the system is, in fact, is it trustworthy or is it not trustworthy, also refers to who is behind the system. So if I think OpenAI does things that are very like benevolent for society or anything, then I could say the product that they produce, they develop, they produce ChatGPT has these values in it. It is based on these values. And then I always get to the point where I say, okay, maybe it is possible if we say it is never distinguishable. You cannot distinguish the product, the system, from its developers. But I definitely see this point of we shouldn't be so anthropomorphic about those systems. And that's really, I also think that the tension between should we say, should we not say it. The EU has this high-level expert group on trustworthy AI, isn't it? And there it's really a question of whether it's so explicitly made the point that we shouldn't be so anthropomorphic. We should consider it. So I think it's a very good point, and I'm still on that line of saying we cannot distinguish, so we can say something about trust and trustworthiness, but only if we consider the ones behind the systems.
Yeah, so for me, it is a question of perspective and goals in the end. So as a psychologist, for me, it is important to address the well-being of people, to address an outcome in the interaction with these systems in terms of functionality of the system, in terms of do people reach their goals and do they feel good about it. And this is what trust is about for me in the end. It's not about producing a system that is claiming to be trustworthy in order to get people to trust it more. It's about changing the interaction with the system in a way that people understand it and feel good about it and are able to use it in a positive manner in the end. And I think, therefore, it is good to use a term like trust to describe the individual feelings, perceptions, and decision-making processes on a psychological level. In the end, from an objective view, from an outside view on the individual, trust is secondary, of course, because then the outcome, the actual results of the interaction are more important, also from a technological viewpoint. But on a moral level, also psychological level, this, how do people feel about it? How sure are they when they interact with the system? How do they know what happens and stuff like that do play a role? And I think trust is it's a concept that helps us to understand how people think about technology and what we should include in the technology in order to make people feel better about it and use it better. So for me, trustworthiness on the side of the system is indeed a term that is questionable to some regard because it's highly individual, it's highly situational specific. So this is also what Marcus says, I think, when he uses the term. But the perception of trustworthiness is something that is really, really worthwhile to consider because it goes hand in hand with how people feel and how well they use technology. And this is essential, I think, to build machines that are moral, to build machines that have a high level of functionality also within our society, I think.
Is that me left then, right? Or Irina needs to also go, but I see that
wherever everyone can say.
I'm happy to add my voice to the runde. So I think one thing I should probably specify is that so you were talking primarily about trustworthiness of the agent. And I think I'm interested in what I call trust, but which I'm not entirely sure what that is, because I'm actually measuring what I think leads to the establishing that social contract. What I mean by that is I look at lower level sensory-motor coordination, or I look at physiological arousal. I look at what I think are probably precursors to a decision to trust another agent. Now, with that being said, all of that assumes that there is a change in state at some point, which I am, for my intents and purposes, saying that it allows me to behave, and that's, I think, what Johannes was saying, it changes the way in which I behave with these other agents. I allow myself to be more vulnerable with these other agents. I allow myself to do things I wouldn't otherwise do until I've met this threshold. This is the construct I use because these are the measures that I'm interested in capturing, and then seeing how we can manipulate that. Can we lower that threshold? And that's really the work we do with Irene. Does touch facilitate lowering that threshold? Is it a shortcut? Is it something we've done across evolution to get us to trust one another more quickly? Because all of a sudden we're within reaching distance. We are now, by virtue of being able to touch each other, vulnerable. And so I think the issues I have center around, first of all, distinguishing between the trustworthiness of the individual agents and then the bond of trust between interacting agents. And then sort of throwing the curveball that, well, really it's an arbitrary thing if instead we should just focus on outward behavior, like the kinds of things that Johannes mentioned a few minutes ago, but also that we heard from Linda yesterday. I think what really we need in this discussion, we say, is it something that we really need? There are various aspects to that question. The one is, do we need to talk about trust, or can we talk about the lower level mechanisms that I'm interested in, or the changing in behavior that Johannes is talking about? Do we just need the word so we know what we're talking about when we're talking to these different levels? And do we need that contract at all? Well, I would stipulate that, of course we do. Like, clearly something changes so that we behave differently with others. So we need some kind of stronger bond. I like the idea that you said that maybe you establish a bond with non-biological agents as a function of their reliability. And as soon as we've reached that threshold of reliability, okay, I trust you to mow my lawn or to vacuum my living room. Do we need trust? So the last thing I wanted to mention, and maybe this can start another round, is I mentioned at the beginning of our session today that some developmental psychologists made me scratch my head because of the special case of trust in children. Like, when they interact, do they, for example, and I maybe throw this question out to either Irene, who works in developmental psychology, or to you, John, because do they require certain norms to be met? Do they have a full set of norms established, and at which age does this come to fruition? So that's my onward question I send out to you all.
So I can't really speak too much about. What I do know, of course, are the famous studies that Tomasello has talked about a lot in his work, where children at a very young age, like 18, 19 months, where they're still able to like crawl around and stuff, if they see an adult struggle and need some help, like they not even seeing what exactly it is, like they'll immediately respond and want to help. So this need for us to cooperate and for us to assist another is well deeply ingrained in us as a species. Even before children really have acquired fully functional language, they're willing to sort of help. And we don't see that in other species, right? Even chimpanzees that are super close to us, they're like our cousins. Even they won't help unless like they see that there's a problem and it's like a reaching thing that they can quickly help. And even then they'll sort of like sit and wait, like before they finally help. So like we are these very altruistic. One thing that gives me hope about humanity is we are a very at nature and altruistic kind of species. As children, our infancy is so long, right, that we could not survive if we didn't have altruistic people take care of us the first 5 years of our lives. So yeah, trust is absolutely essential. And what I think, my thinking, the philosophically enriched sort of notions around trust, what they give us, what we gain by thinking about it this way, is it helps us do a number of different things. Like one, it helps us to point out that like this technology, trust, that's fundamentally a wrong thing to do, right? Because it's just a tool. It doesn't have it's not a normative agent, at least not yet. And so it's wrong to do that. So you should never trust ChatGPT, never, categorically. What you should trust potentially, are the people who make it, right? And so the second thing that this does, right, is it allows us to target our frustration as citizens in a democracy at the right people, right? So we target our representatives in the European Parliament or in the German Parliament. We target OpenAI, and we target the system that allows for this kind of corporate ownership, all right? We target the people and hold them accountable, as opposed to like wasting energy at trying to hold something that can't be held accountable, right? At least not until it's a moral agent, which might happen one day, who knows? So that's another advantage. The third thing that's really important, and I'll leave it there, is that it's as a matter of science communication. So we are scientists, we're philosophers, we have a kind of epistemic authority, right? We're in a position of knowing more about this technology than the average user of it does, certainly more than my family and my friends and the people that use this technology. And we have a responsibility to be careful about the words that we use. And when we talk about this stuff as trustworthy, we're connoting, along with that word, right, that they can trust it, that they can be vulnerable around it, when they cannot be. They cannot be. And we're failing them when we're doing this, in my view, right? We're misleading them. And we're putting in their minds a category mistake, right? Which is a fault in thinking, right? So we're creating bad epistemic behavior in people when we do this, right? And so I think by what the philosophy tells us is it helps us direct our frustration at who it needs to be, and it helps clear up our minds to think correctly, and it makes us better communicators, science communicators. So that's what I wanted to say.
Marcus, do you want to answer to that?
I'm very much pro this thinking of how do we speak, and that's how we speak affects people, and that's really a point. Maybe I'm not so. I would not say that by saying it's trust. When we talk about trustworthy, we already tell people that this is kind of, it can be trustworthy, and it is trustworthy. But what I try to do when I talk about trustworthiness with people, I try to tell them, hey, that's a big point. It's not like you should always follow those things. Please be mindful when you use them. Please, my students, be mindful when you use those things to write your essays or for whatever you use it, because it is not trustworthy. Or it produces good outputs. It produces reliable outputs. Maybe that's the point. It can produce them. But you should always consider how this thing works, how it is developed, that it's only a parrot that produces these texts that sound very nice and that look very nice and that produce a lot of cues for trustworthiness, or cues for whatever you would call it then, like the cues for reliability, because it tells you, oh, I'm sorry, that was a mistake, but now it's correct. Or it gives you this very nicely fleshed out texts in seconds. And this is the point where I say, maybe it's also good to tell people, be aware of the trustworthiness or reliability. We can definitely debate whether it's good or bad, how we talk there. And yes, as scientists, we should definitely use the words where we think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it is an ongoing question. As you say, it's a thing where we really need to be careful also when we anthropomorphize too much. But it's also hard not to anthropomorphize those things. It's really an ongoing thing. Yeah.
I would also add to that, as psychologists, we are kind of always very careful with what we say really loudly. And I have the feeling in this field, it's really important that we take on also responsibility a bit more. So this is always a hard thing for scientists to do, but it is exactly what all this conversation is about. In the end, of course, we are investigating trustworthiness, but we are no advocates of these systems in the end, right? So we are not saying like, yeah, we want them to be out there. In the end, most of our findings, or like some findings really show people over trust these systems and stuff like that. So it is really important that we also take these findings out there, communicate them more strongly, also with some, you know, like this yeah, we can do this attitude. So like we have something to say here, and please listen to that in designing these machines, because in the end they affect humans and how humans feel. And yeah, and we have to work together interdisciplinary on that. And this is also why it is so important to bring the people from different disciplines together in a format like this, for example, and use this shared knowledge to also get it out there in the industry, in governance and stuff like that, to like really change the rules of how these systems can be designed and what tasks they can do, and which role they play in our society in the end. I mean, it's a matter of fact, they change so many things, and this cannot be done in a vacuum of not paying respect to how people think about them, make decisions with them, or what it means on a more philosophical level at the end to have these machines. So I really think like this is maybe one takeaway here, that we have to make our voices heard also out there.
We haven't heard enough from Irene. Irene, do you have anything to add to the discussion? You're always too polite.
Maybe, yeah, I was being polite. No, I was being, I was paying attention to the discussion. But maybe I can pick up on the developmental aspects that you were mentioning before, to also move to the second question of the panel discussion, since we have a couple of minutes, which is how do we measure trust, provided that we need trust. So looking at development is very interesting, because we can see how a specific mechanism or concept builds up. And with the question, when do children start trusting other people, I don't think there's a specific moment where they start doing that, but there are pre-appearing, like earlier markers that then lead to trust as a more complicated metacognitive thing. So also as a measurement strategy, if we just look at the final metacognitive complex mechanism of trust, we are missing the building pieces. So for example, when the newborn is born, they already have preferences. They prefer the parents' smell and faces compared to strangers' smell and faces. And this, I think, can be a trust related index, a very, very little one, like something that should become something more complicated. But I feel this trust research field sometimes neglects that, like the small little pieces that then lead to trust. So more at the implicit behavioral, physiological, and neural level, we don't know much about what trust means.